My name's Nick Bracks and I'm here today with Domini Stuart, and we're going to be talking about the work she's doing and her book, which is called All Sides of Suicide. And yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So I might,
Thanks, Nick.
if you could just give us an introduction on yourself and a bit of a background about the work that you are doing and have done and how it all came about.
Sure. Well, my own issues started as long ago as when I was 13. I remember thinking about suicide as long ago as being 13, but for the next few years I sort of sublimated it into really bad poetry. And then it wasn't really until I went to university and I started drinking. I developed a problem with alcohol. I also had eating disorders. I smoked 3 packets of Marlboro Reds a day. And I became very depressed. I was, for a decade, it was sort of lost time for me. I attempted suicide quite a number of times. I was in and out of intensive care units and so on. And at that time, there was very little help available. But I managed to sort of put a lid on all that when, completely out of the blue, I found I was pregnant. I'd been told I couldn't have children because of my eating disorders. And so I changed my behaviour for the sake of my children. But it was always sort of lurking in the background, if you like, because I hadn't really addressed the issues, or not so much the issues. I understood why I reacted as I did. I'd had a perfectly loving and comfortable childhood, but my father died when I was a baby, and then my mother died when I was 22. I had a sort of sense of loss and abandonment and a sense of being unworthy that I think happens with children when they lose people close to them like that. So I understood the issues. It was more trying to find strategies to help me deal with them, which I eventually did when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I was put in touch with an absolutely amazing counsellor who helped me to understand that there were steps that I could take to cope and to manage the issues I had, which set me in good stead for when my son committed suicide when he was 19. And so I've sort of seen the suicidal aspect from two sides, from my own experiences and from being someone whose son died. So that was the beginning of everything, if you like.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think it's a really important point what you've said there as well. When you were growing up and you had an understanding, you actually understood what was going on, but it didn't exactly have the solution to coping with it, which I think is a really important thing, because there's a lot of awareness out there, but then how we can know
deal with it.
How do we cope with
exactly.
it?
Because I mean, the one thing when I was in my 20s and I was really struggling, I did see psychiatrists, but it was, and I know it's changed now, but back then it was really just someone lying you on a couch and sitting behind you and asking you about your childhood. But I was studying psychology at the time, and I knew that, I understood the impact my childhood had had. But no one was telling me how I could stop feeling how I was feeling. And at the time then too, no one really understood eating disorders. And so there was no actual help offered to me in terms of, how to manage how I felt.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with, a psychologist or a psychiatrist a lot of the time as well, we can be given information that helps in that session, but then when we leave, it's how do we put into place daily practices or create habits that we can then use to really improve our long-term behaviour.
Exactly. And I mean, if you ask me one thing that changed everything for me, it was the idea that I could make choices but not just big choices, but literally minute by minute choices as to whether something made me feel better or worse. And I still do that all the time. When I'm trying to make a decision about anything, I think, will it make me feel better or worse? Often it makes you feel better in the short term, but worse in the long term.
Yeah, definitely.
So, it's obviously, it's a process rather than a simple yes or no. But it sounds ridiculous. It sounds so simple, but the problem was that I always felt that my life was out of control,
Yeah.
that it sort of had nothing to do with me. You know,
Yeah.
it was just
Yeah.
running away with me. And the idea that I could even make a decision as small as getting up and getting dressed in the morning, because I mean, I work freelance, so I can wear my pajamas all day if I want to,
Yeah.
you know. So
Yeah.
just that sort of something that small. And then I found that giving myself a tick and a star when I'd done something like that
Yeah.
helped me to make the next decision a little more positive. And so that was a hugely important strategy for me. But I mean, that works within certain parameters, obviously. It's not going to work necessarily if you're really, you know, at rock bottom and you can't even think what makes you feel. It happened after my son died. I couldn't even think about better or worse. You know,
Yeah.
I couldn't possibly have felt worse, and I certainly couldn't think of anything that would make me feel better.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it's all about the circumstances.
Circumstantial, but you know, a really valid point. A lot of the time when I'm delivering a seminar, I will say to them, you know, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is very common sense, and I think, like you said, it sounds like common sense with trying to, you know, control our decision making and looking at it. Will this make me feel better or worse? But it is something that we neglect so often, and anxiety is, you know, most of the time, all of these outside circumstances that are happening that we feel like we can't control and that our life is out of control. So if we can take some of that back and eliminate that uncertainty, that is, you know, a really powerful way to help with that.
And it's interesting because I found the same thing too. When I'm giving talks, sometimes as part of my talk I've said something and I've thought, that is just really obvious, you know, and then I'm going to cut it out. And then someone comes up at the end and said, I'd never thought of that. You know, that's made a real difference to me. So I think it's important because I think you can get used to it yourself, can't you?
Well, it's 100% what's happened to me. It's sort of, when I go and do them, and I got to a point, because I've been doing them for about 10 years now.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been doing it longer. But you're going and delivering this information, and I started thinking, you know, is this actually even giving anyone benefit? Because I've just talked about it for so long, and I think because you become passionate about trying to help with the cause, you forget that a lot of that information people are not hearing every day. We're hearing it every day because we're talking about it, we're reading about it, we're researching it, but for outside people, that is really valuable and important information. So it's reminding yourself, I think, as well, that there is a need that we, you know, to spread this as wide as we can. So I want to ask you about your son's suicide and why you wrote this book. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Well, after he died, I wanted to keep as far away from anything to do with suicide as possible. But then I gradually started introducing it into the talks I was giving, because at the time I was mainly focused on just the things that had happened when I was in my 20s and so on. And I realised that the stories I'd been telling were about me having a completely happy ending. I used to talk about the problems I had when I was younger, the strategies I'd found, and then look as if I was absolutely fine. I felt that was what people needed to hear. But then I realised that a couple of days before I did a talk, I had a dark period, and I realised that was rubbish. I was a million times better, but I wasn't 100% fixed. And so I decided to introduce that concept into my talks, and that went down really well. I think people have an idea about positivity and resilience, that it's all about being back to the way you were, back to perfection and so on. And I don't think that's the case. And I found that when I talked about sitting with your, acknowledging your feelings and then sitting with them, that people responded really well to that. And that was when I started to think about needing to look at suicide in a broader context, if you like, that it isn't necessarily a question of feeling depressed, feeling suicidal, then feeling better. It can be a matter of managing that mental illness or your feelings and finding a way to accommodate those into your life.
Yeah, and that was actually the next thing I was going to ask you about, the broader view on suicide. And I think it's really interesting what you said about perfectionism as well. I think that can cause so many problems, and I mean, at the end of the day, what is perfect? There's no such thing anyway, and we're always trying to create these perfect scenarios or find the perfect path or find the perfect way of going about things, which doesn't exist. There's only different ways of approaching situations. So
Exactly.
it's also, yeah.
And I think that's where stories, lived stories, if you like, can be so helpful, because you think that you're the only one
Yeah.
suffering in a particular way or feeling particular feelings, and then when you read about other people and or hear them speak and realize that there are other people who, and as you say, I mean, what's perfection? I talk about being fixed or not being fixed, but I don't know what our vision of being fixed is really. You know, I mean, is it never being depressed? Is it never feeling anxious? Is it, you know? I mean, I think that's totally unrealistic anyway. So it's the degrees. It's finding a place you can sit comfortably with yourself, I think, rather than striving for a total cure.
Majorly. I mean, and a lot of the stuff I talk about is the fact that it is actually more normal, even if you don't actually suffer from a mental health illness, it's more normal to have, you know, ups and downs and not being as part of the human experience. And I think it's pretty abnormal for someone to just feel good all the time.
Exactly.
So
and I think there's a bit of a problem in that, because it's like, after my son died, I didn't take antidepressants. And it wasn't that I've got anything against antidepressants or medication. I think they can work wonderfully for people who need them. But I felt that people who were suggesting I took them weren't giving me a chance to sort out what was normal grief and what was abnormal and needed to be treated. And so I think that we tend to jump in a bit quickly and not allow ourselves to actually feel normal feelings, which, as you say, you know, I mean, we can't just be on a level all the time without having natural anxieties or unhappy periods of unhappiness or whatever.
Yeah, which what you're saying as well goes back to why it is so important that we raise awareness and educate people about all of these different areas, because I think a lot of the time when someone is going through something difficult or have past experiences that they need to deal with, it'll be pushed away and there's not that self-awareness, or even when there is that self-awareness, it might be seen as just being too confronting and too painful. So then things like alcohol or other mechanisms are used to cope, which you're just pushing it down and pushing it down. It's like if you're trying to shove, you know, continually shove more garbage in a bin and push it down, eventually it's going to overflow.
Yeah, exactly.
So it'll explode. So
but that's, I mean, if we go back to grief for a minute, I mean, there's a huge, I think it's a myth that after the funeral brings closure. It's like, you know, once you've been to a funeral, you just get on with your life as if nothing's happened. And people expect you to do that. And it's not realistic.
Well, it's not life. That's the very binary sort of,
exactly.
simplistic way of looking at it, which nothing in life is simple and everything's an ongoing process and everything takes work. And if you do have a mental health issue and you get over it, it doesn't mean you're cured. It's going to be like anything else, a ongoing process, which, you know, I'm sure you can relate to. Yeah.
And I think I think another thing that's happened reasonably recently is that sort of supports this idea of striving for protection.
Or protection. Yeah, protection as well. Yeah.
Is the sort of the so-called happiness industry, you know, get happy, be happy, whatever, as if happiness is just the natural state, when in fact it's an aspect of being a human being. It's not, you shouldn't be striving for endless happiness because, you know, it doesn't exist.
Well, I think it's also the definition of happiness, because happiness is seen as the ultimate goal, but the perception a lot of the time of happiness is when I obtain something, when I, you know, feel this, have this adrenaline rush or whatever it is, but that's not happiness. That's experiencing a high, the same as what you get if you take drugs or alcohol.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, happiness is actually what people need to understand is feeling peace and feeling contentment, which you could have a whole range of, you know, difficult things happening externally in your life, but you could also have found that inner peace, which means, you know, that whether things are amazingly good or bad, it's finding how can I condition my mind or get to that point where I can just find that inner peace to be able to deal with the ups and the downs that life throws at us. Yeah.
It is what it is.
It is. Yeah, exactly. So I was going to ask you about zero suicide and how some people can't be helped and what, you know, the societal view on that.
Well, I found that although, I mean, it started for me, I started thinking about this when there were initiatives like Are You OK Day coming into play, which I think are fantastic, and they've done an amazing job of getting people to talk and, helping to remove the stigma and so on. But for someone on the other side, when it started to become popular and I was seeing all of this stuff in my inbox on Facebook and so on, I started to feel quite judged by it, because I think that people can interpret it as being something that you can do that prevents suicide. So, you ask someone if they're okay, and that prevents suicide. So I felt as if, because my son had died, that I was being judged as someone who obviously hadn't asked the right question. So that made me realise that initiatives like that are hugely important, but they're just a piece in a much more complex puzzle. And so I started thinking about the other pieces, and I then started to come across the concept of zero suicide, which I think originally started within a healthcare environment, but has sort of spread a bit. And you see quite a few organisations and charities who have that as their goal. And I think that's really dangerous, because I believe that most suicides can be prevented, but not all.
Yeah.
And the implication is, if all suicides can be prevented, when someone dies, someone's to blame.
Yeah.
And the person to blame is usually the person who's grieving most and is already vulnerable. And so I think that it's really, we're walking a very fine line, because obviously we want to encourage people to get help, and we want to get out the message that help is available, that most people can respond to that and will either get better or learn to accommodate whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who everything's been done. They've had every type of care, support, help, medication that they can, and they still take their own lives.
Yeah.
And I think often those people have been in that situation for a long time, and the people who are caring for them put their own physical and mental health at risk by looking after them. And I think it's really dangerous for us to even think that they could have done more, or that they were responsible in some way. And so that's why I think, it's a very positive message, but I think it can go a step too far too.
Yeah.
And because, I think that there's already people judge people who have someone close to them kill themselves as being more guilty than someone who has someone who dies by natural causes. And I think there's a reason for that. And for instance, after my son died, someone came up to me soon afterwards and said, I was so sorry to hear about it. As soon as I heard, I said to my boys, you must always come to me if you have a problem. You can always talk to me. So, of course, the implication was that my son hadn't talked to me and that I hadn't been there for him. So when she said it, I felt really angry. But then I thought afterwards, it's almost a self-protective mechanism, because you want to feel that you can do something to protect the people who are close to you. And the only way you can believe that is to look at someone like me and think, I did something wrong.
To feel in control.
So I understand where it comes from, but I also think that it's something we need to consider in terms of the realities around some suicides. So I don't, as I say, it's a very fine line. You don't want to give people the impression that help doesn't work.
Yeah.
But the reality is that just sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, and what you're saying to me makes perfect sense, because obviously we are aiming to eliminate as many suicides as possible, but it's also working towards that goal and that cause with the understanding that there will still be suicides that happen that can't be controlled. And it's the same, I guess, analogy if you were an athlete and you wanted to win a gold medal, and obviously that's the end goal, you want to win the gold medal, but if you said at all cost, if I don't get that gold medal, I'm a failure, well then you're setting yourself up for something kind of unrealistic.
There aren't many people who actually win gold medals, are there?
So, that's the goal, but you might not get there, but if you end up having a good career, then you're accepting that there are certain variables that we can't control, but we're going to be aiming for the best possible outcome that we can get
Yeah,
to.
I think what we need to be aiming for is the best possible care
Yeah.
being available to people who need it.
Yeah.
And it's a sad reality that it isn't always there.
It's not there, which was the next thing I was going to ask you. What's your view on people that can't always be helped or could be ignored, such as homeless people and alcoholics, people that have addictions, people living in poverty? What's your view on that in that area with suicide?
Well, I think that's one aspect of not being able to get help. I think that we tend to, we know, for instance, that people with a gambling addiction have a higher rate of suicide than people who don't. But we promote gambling and we make it, and we also know that alcohol and gambling are more likely to promote the sorts of behaviours that make you feel ashamed or depressed or out of control afterwards, and yet all the pokies are in places where there's cheap alcohol, and there's a lot of stuff. This is the point of it being complicated. I think that we need to look at these aspects. And poverty, children living in poverty, of course, it becomes a circular thing again. That of course they're more likely to have mental illnesses if they never know where the next meal's going to come from. But once they have a mental illness, it becomes much harder for them to get out of poverty. And so they're huge social issues. But I also think on a sort of more personal level, getting help isn't always as easy as it sounds. And it costs money, and even although you can get subsidised help, it's limited. So I think it's 10 sessions a year. But that's just scraping the surface if you're someone who's got really deep and complex issues. And a lot of people can't afford even the gap, that it's not always free. So there's a cost issue. There's also the issue that, some psychologists and counsellors work outside of working hours, but not that many. And so if you're at work, it can be quite difficult. We talk about talking about mental illness in the workplace, but at the same time, it's not always well accepted by employers. And there's research from England that showed that the vast majority of bosses are very cautious about people who admit to having any sort of mental illness. And one of the people I interviewed for the book, and she thought it would be fair to tell her boss that she was coming off antidepressants because she wanted to get pregnant. And he actually shared that information with other people who then used it to bully her. So it's not that easy. And then if you say, I need to have 2 hours off every week, it's sort of fueling that idea that it's not a good thing to have people with mental illnesses in the workplace. So you tend to keep it to yourself.
Yeah. Which I was going to ask you about as well. With you're answering all of my questions. Mental health and speaking out about it in the workplace. I know as well from the work that I do that's a really big issue. What's your view on how that can be improved? Do you think it's sort of by just the general awareness raising, educating people, having better systems in place, or?
I think it's got a lot to do with stigma, because people, and I think that's being addressed, by encouraging people to talk about it more. But I think that as there is with so many things that appear to be common sense, there's actually an economic benefit, because given that so many people do have some sort of mental illness at one level or another, if you actually acknowledge that and give them the support they need to get the help they need, then you're going to have a much more productive workforce. I think when you're driving people underground, as it were, that's causing more stress in itself. And you're just going to end up with absenteeism or presenteeism. People are just not working to their full potential because they don't feel able to get the help they need.
Yeah, definitely. Well, PwC did a big research study on that, and I think they worked out for around every $1 that a company will invest in mental health services, there will be a return of about $1.30. So there's facts around it as well.
And I don't know that many people actually understand that economic benefit. Let's face it. That's what drives most things. Most change. It's when it comes down to economics, and I think that may be. I think a lot of employers don't quite trust that.
Yeah.
Because it sounds a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? That if you give people more time off from work,
Yeah.
that you're actually going to benefit from that. So
Yeah.
I think there's a strong message there to there's an educational process.
Yeah, definitely.
To encourage people to do that. I mean, there's talk now of letting people have days off for not feeling good, as opposed to mentally, as opposed to physically. And I think, I mean, that's a step in the right direction. But
definitely. It can be just as debilitating, if not more.
Exactly, exactly. So there are sort of little steps in the right direction, but I think that it's not broadly accepted yet that it's a really good thing to do.
Yeah. But at least it's getting there, and that conversation is starting. And another thing I was going to ask you is, a lot of the time, well, I read in your book how, I wasn't as aware of this, but how suicides can be disguised as being an accident or put down as, when they're being sort of displayed to society. What impact is that having, and is that a common thing that?
Well, apparently, I mean, I didn't know until I started researching the book, and I didn't know that coroners have some sort of leeway in the decisions they make.
Yeah.
And when it's something like a single person in a car travelling at speed, or someone overdosing on drugs, then they can take factors into account like the family and family responses, and even insurance. I think they can take in. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily write it down, but if it was someone disguising a suicide. So there's a lot of suicide that doesn't actually get reported as suicide, and I think that's dangerous for a couple of reasons. One, unless we know how many people are actually taking their own lives, it's hard to assess and allocate resources that we need to prevent it, or to provide the help we need. But also, it's sort of fostering the idea that there's something shameful about it, and that families need to be protected. And I think a lot of the language that we use about suicide, depression less so, the stigma I think is it's starting to be chipped away. But when it comes to suicide, and I think you only have to look, if someone dies, if someone well-known dies, probably from some sort of drug influence, the first thing the family will say is, he would never do that. He wasn't that kind of person. He would never leave his family like that. And that is, the implication from that is that someone like my son is that kind of person, whatever that kind of person is, but obviously not a good one. Someone who would do that, someone who would leave their families to suffer. And so it leaves the families feeling that somehow it is a shameful thing they should hide or disguise or not tell the truth about. But I also think that it's just really damaging to have this idea that people don't care about the people they love. Because in the majority of cases, and I've spoken as well as people who have experience, I've spoken to people who are psychologists and people working with people in suicidal situations, and they agree that in most cases, when you feel that low, you think your family will be better off without you.
Yeah.
And so it's not that act of selfishness that people say, and how could he leave his children? It's because, and I've been there myself, you genuinely believe that people would be better off without you. And I think we should be trying to help people understand that, rather than coming up with ways to protect people from the idea that someone close to them might have committed suicide, because it's a shameful thing to do. Yeah.
It's actually the opposite. They're feeling that much despair that they think it's going to, like you said, make things better.
Yeah.
And when you're in that state, I guess, when things, I mean, you're saying you've been through it yourself, when it does feel, you feel so down, things are so bleak that even things that you normally love just don't have meaning or don't make you happy anymore. How do you, well, from your experience, what's helped you in that situation? Because that,
well, these days it's the knowledge that I'm allowed to have those feelings.
Yeah.
that I can sit with them. And I do sometimes think in quite an extreme way, but I always know that this is just me allowing myself to feel and to think through what I'm actually feeling.
Yeah.
And then I go back to the really small steps thing, you know. I mean, I let myself feel that bad for as long as I need to, basically.
Yeah.
And then when I can start to feel the tide turning a little, I start to think about just a tiny thing that I could do that would start me on that path back to feeling a little bit better, and then a little bit better.
Yeah.
But I just think it's really important to understand that you can be in that darker place and you can also get out of it, and that you can live it. I mean, one of the people I spoke to who has multiple issues, he says that he feels suicidal on an almost daily basis, and he spent a long time trying to fix that, and now he's just realised that it's a part of his life, so he just sits through it, and he's got a really productive life outside of that. You know, he does really well. He speaks. I mean, he talks to other people.
I read I read about him. It was really fascinating.
He's a really amazing person, and I think that I think sometimes we can be so afraid that if we get into that darker place, that there's no way out of it. That we can sort of skate around it, whereas in fact, confronting your greatest fears sometimes are the ways to start turning it around and coming out.
Definitely, yeah, and that's what I try and tell people. That sort of, and no matter how extreme an emotion is, it's like a wave. Like it always passes as well. A good emotion, a bad emotion, a neutral emotion, whatever it is, that none of it's permanent. So it's realizing that and realizing that things. It's just in that moment, not letting it consume you, and that's not the reality. It's just how you're.
You don't have to react to it.
You don't have to react, which a lot of that's mindfulness that comes into it, where from what I learned when I first started doing the talks, for example, I would be terrified before I used to be so shy and scared of being judged and all these different things, and I'd be terrified. My mind was telling me, you know, you can't do this, you're going to fail, people are going to judge you, the world's going to end, blah, 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 blah. And you keep doing them, and those thoughts don't completely go away, but they become much more distant, and you disempower the thoughts, because the more times that you do it and you prove the thoughts wrong, they might still be there, or that emotion might be there, but it doesn't have that hold on you, because you know, well, no, that's not real.
The other thing, and I think I was exactly the same. I think another thing is to learn about the voice in your head. And listen to what it's saying. And again, that sounds really obvious, but I'd never heard my voice until someone pointed it out. My counsellor pointed it out. And I used to just feed myself just endless negative talk, you know. And I think a lot of us do. And you're just having this conversation. It's like your worst enemy constantly telling you that you're a failure.
That's crazy.
There's no point in trying that because you'll only fail. And and then it's only when you actually hear that voice and you think, well, that's not actually true, is it? You know, or not necessarily true. But you know, it's not necessarily true. It's like thinking if someone passes you in the street and ignores you, you think, oh well, you know, they must hate me. I've done something terrible, and they might just have been looking the other way, or you know, you just don't know what's going on in people's heads.
You have no idea, and it's a crazy thing, because it's sort of, I guess, if you think about. If you were talking to someone that you really care about and that you love and trying to give them advice, and how you would speak to them and the advice you would give them, and then you go...
Yeah, exactly,
and
exactly.
Then thinking, okay, well, that's what I'm treating them with care and respect, and then in my own head I'm beating myself up and telling myself all these negative things. It's crazy.
I've done exactly that with my kids. And I'd say, if a friend came to you with exactly what you've just said, what would you say to them? And you certainly wouldn't say, well, there's no point in you know, I mean, it's just, but you're right. I mean, one of my big things is being kind to yourself. You know, because
so important.
We can be horrible. We can just be so horrible to ourselves.
I think we can be our own worst enemies,
exactly,
really.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I was going to also ask you about your view on you touched on it earlier, on technology for mental health. It's becoming a bigger thing. Do you think that is able to help people in a bigger way as it evolves, or
I think so. I mean, I think it can play a huge role in filling that gap between people who need help and can't get it quickly, or can't afford to have it consistently. Because I mean, already we have apps where you can talk to people at any time or whatever. And I mean, initial research with chatbots, for instance, shows that some people can actually be more open when they know they're talking to a machine. I mean, I know some of the apps actually have psychologists on, but some you actually talk to a chatbot. And for some people, they find that reassuring because they're not afraid of being judged or criticised, or even subliminally criticised. And so I think that could be a huge investment, a really practical investment, could be providing people with that sort of support, so that because it's available out of hours, it's available anywhere you have an internet connection or a phone. So.
It can be very beneficial and reach a broader demographic as well. If they, a lot of rural areas, there's huge problems because they don't have access or support, or all those kind of things. So I guess it's all a step in the right direction again. And just to finish up with, I was going to ask you, could the government be investing in more resources for mental health services and helping with these issues? What more could they do? I know, like recently I was in Queensland and I did a talk, and I was talking to someone locally there who is working on a whole lot of initiatives, and he was telling me with one of the things he's working on is trying to get the government to help improve facilities for people that are suicidal, and rather than going into a hospital and having to either wait for hours to get a bed or being discharged early because there's not enough help there, and then going and harming themselves later on. What more can be done? Do you think the government can invest more into
I think there are certainly resources that could be helpful. I mean, one thing, for example, is that eating disorders are associated with a particularly high rate of suicide, and yet I think there are less than 30 beds across the whole of Australia that are dedicated to eating disorders. It's a ridiculously low figure, and so obviously there are resources in terms of supporting people in that way. But I also think that we need, as a society, to look at what is underpinning a lot of because it isn't always a mental illness. I mean, it can be a reaction to something. A feeling of despair doesn't have to be a mental illness. You can feel desperate because you are poor and you don't see a way out of your situation, or you're in a situation where you're grieving and aren't getting support for that. But I think as a society, we just need to look at being more helpful to people who are struggling. I mean, it's easy to just focus on the people who have an obvious reaction to something like, I don't know, they break up with their girlfriend, or they lose a job, or fail an exam, become very depressed very quickly. And in that case, you do talk about it and you're over it, and you look back and you think, why on earth did I do that? But I think we need to look at the more pervasive underlying causes and do what we can to help. Homelessness, poverty, abuse, childhood abuse is another. I mean, people who've suffered from childhood abuse, I think there should be automatic resources for them if you find out about it. But you don't know. It's something, again, that people tend to keep quiet. So certainly there's a lot more to do. And again, there's an economic aspect to it, because I understand that American research found it costs something close to $60 billion a year dealing with the aftermath of suicide and attempted suicide. It costs money. It's not like just putting money into resources and not getting anything back. It costs money to have to cope with all of that. So,
it's another part of it. Well, I'm sure we could probably talk all day about all the offsets of these different areas, but no, thank you so much for coming in. It's been pleasure. Fascinating reading your book and learning about it, and thank you for sharing that today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.